Take a moment to settle back, see, look and check, see where your questions are, whether you have one to articulate or not. It's good always to look and kind of check to see, where is my practice? Where is my practice? Sometimes I think in terms of where's the edge of my practice? Over time, I can have some sense that I get up to a certain point, but there's something there I can feel, something that is in the center of my attention for what I'm working on. It's good also to look and see where we have any kind of confusion or doubts. Sometimes just little things that we missed along the way in a teaching or something that we read, whatever it is. Linda.
So I've read in a couple different places over this last month talking about the visualization, about how it's not daydreaming, that it's more imagination. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying, just need a little more clarification on that.
Okay, and which practice are you talking about?
Chenrezig or...
Chenrezig, all right. Then we need to back up to bring some other people kind of into the conversation, or at least allow them to say, oh, I guess this is a part of something that I'm not working on at the moment. You could say there are two general styles of practice that we do, and we just did one of them, which you could say the essence of that is simplicity. And the practice itself is characterized by this meeting experience as it arises, whether we use the breath or something else as a means to let the mind settle so that we can have a deeper sense of our experience, meet it more intimately. The other style of practice that we do is a style of practice that utilizes the capacity for the mind basically to fabricate reality. We tend to think of ourselves as innocent bystanders for reality. Reality is something that happens, and we're just kind of innocent bystanders for something that's going on. Here we are in the middle of this thing. But our reality, our experience, is actually something that is synthesized. What we notice, what we don't notice, what we react to in one way, what we don't react to, the things we like, we don't like. That whole sense of our personal reality is, you could say, a fabrication. It's cobbled together. And in the style of practice that Linda is referring to, we actively use this creative capacity of the mind in you could say just in the first place, just to notice that we're able to do this, that we are doing this. And in this style of practice, we imagine ourselves in a different form, because we're imagining ourselves in one form, so then we use the imagination of ourselves in another form. Just notice how it is that we're actually imagining ourselves. That's a piece of it. And the same thing with the environment. So when it comes to how it is that we use our imagination, in these practices, there is a very clear script for it. We imagine ourselves in a particular form. And you mention, yeah, it's definitely not daydreaming. It's definitely not daydreaming, because that's just sort of the mind just kind of wandering off a little bit. Gets a little bit of input from the teachings, and then just kind of wanders. That's sort of the daydreaming. And then we're lost back in it's just kind of another bit of fabrication without the clarity. So then one of the most critical things in this style of practice, you could say, the word Vajrayana comes up, so we'll just say, yes, that's Vajrayana practice includes this. In this style of practice, it's the clarity about how our imagination is working is kind of a critical piece. So being able to bring the attention to it, and being able to see that this is actually something that the mind is creating. That's a critical piece of it. So the clarity is important in that. There are other dimensions to these practices that basically include every aspect of practice that you can imagine, including the cultivation of loving kindness, the cultivation of devotion, all these things. And so from those sides, sometimes the thing that we lean into more is a sense of things, a sense of the presence, a sense of connection, and opening ourselves to things that we don't usually consider ourselves connected to. Just like we don't usually consider ourselves intimately connected to and close to any source of enlightenment, any manifestation of enlightenment. We don't think of ourselves as, you could say, next door neighbors to the Buddha. But that's part of what we're cultivating in these practices, is this sense of the immediacy, the lack of barrier for those things. So from that point of view, then the sense of the presence is important. But in terms of the actual imagination, the clarity, even if it's just clarity that where the mind rests on one detail, that's more important. So I don't know if that helps, but it's a little bit of a stretch to try to explain in two directions at the same time, and so my apologies for being not masterful in that skill. Please, Dora.
Just from when you compare the word visualization and imagination, one of the points that comes to mind is that visualization, a drawback to that word is that it does seem so visual oriented. And the idea, this one sense, so something we must see and we should see in that detail and whatever. And so I think the word imagination kind of frees us to recognize there's a lot of other aspects of recalling something or creating something. And I like the idea of think of your mother. Okay, your mother. You're gonna remember something visual, but you're gonna remember a whole lot of other things, and maybe she'll be smiling or moving, or and she has characteristics that you recall in that moment. And so if we can get the sense of a yidam or a deity to feel like there's that kind of full, right, not just, not merely seeing, but a much fuller picture.
Can I just mention a technique that has really been helpful for me, which is during that practice to just kind of cast my mind back to the different fills that have been there in the past and think of myself when I was in Santa Fe, how I was, and then how I was in San Francisco and in college, and keep going back and back and back to when I was a little kid and what it felt like to be me, you know, and how I arose at that time, and finally in my mother's arms, and then, I mean, actually just kind of imagining back into the womb and then before the womb. And then it's just, there's nothing there. And it's just so vivid to me that I arose and I created myself through all these stages, and going back to where there was no me is just, it's really powerful to me. It's like this blank slate. Oh, okay. So now, what do I arise as? And it's like, I can arise as anything. And so, well, I choose to arise as Chenrezig. You know, it's just, I don't know, it really works for me somehow to just do that little thought experiment about all the beings that I have made myself into over the decades. Of course, I have a lot of decades, so it's helpful.
Yeah. Just a second. Our usual, you say, like, I was a blank slate. If that was really true, the slate would have stayed blank. And that's one of the elements of this style of practice, is recognizing that kind of where we came from in terms of getting where we are is definitely karmically driven. There are causes and conditions for us to wind up the way we are both in this life and you could say previous lives, and even if you don't say an individual reincarnated previous life, you could definitely say a lot of past causes and conditions contribute to us being in the form and having the tendencies that we have. And one of the elements of the practice of Chenrezig that's can be extended as a general principle is to think of what this life would be like if, instead of the karmic slate, if the slate was writ in full with the profound wish for the liberation of all beings. What form would arise from that? What outlook would arise from that? And so that's actually a critical piece of that practice, is instead of thinking of going through these cycles and iterations of lives that are driven by karma, driven by causes and conditions without awareness, things that arise from confusion, to instead think, how would it actually work? What would arise if my very life form arose out of this wish for the liberation of beings? It's a different outlook, and it's one way. One of the things that we often talk about now and again is we often think of our practice as this little thing that we do within our life. We kind of go time out, and then we take some time and practice and cultivate something, instead of thinking of our entire life as practice. And even if we, it's good to think that we're cultivating something all the time. One way or another, we're cultivating something all the time. So it's not like, oh, I forgot to do my practice. It's more like, I forgot which practice to do. So it's like, ooh. So, okay, since I was practicing, now I'll go back and try to practice something that I think is more useful in the bigger picture, and the perspective that you mentioned of thinking about the whole life arising in a certain way. That's it's good to think of that. At any point, we could actually not be stuck. This requires kind of a profound stabilization and a profound direct insight into how our experience arises. But if we could directly see into that, we would not be stuck in the moment. And then the profound wish of the Bodhisattva, this profound wish, this impulse that actually arises out of that insight, that actually it's not necessary for anybody to be stuck, then that would become the seed for whatever came next in our lives. So basically, we could arise as the Bodhisattva right at that moment. So.
I was just going to mention, I do think it's actually helpful to think of it as imagination. And though, if you took, for example, if you imagine anything, like imagined yourself in a forest or something like that, the reason why we do a scripted practice is because if you think about it, we're imagining stuff all day long. We imagine what we were seeing on TV, or imagining what we heard in the news, or we think about all these different things that we're kind of constantly running this dialogue. And if you have something that you sort of repeatedly imagine, but there's positive aspects to it, like developing compassion or bodhicitta or something like that, if you, I don't know about other people, but I mean, sometimes I find that if you're, you try to imagine something that you haven't imagined before, it's kind of difficult, if you sort of picture this or something in your head. But if you do it repeatedly, it actually really helps. If somebody said, oh, picture yourself in a forest, and you did, and then the next day you did it again, and the next day you did it again, eventually you'd sort of be used to it. You sort of have this developed, and it makes it kind of a clear thing. You're like, oh yeah, I'm sitting in this forest that I pictured 30, 40, 150,000 times before. And so if you do that with a positive quality, you're putting all that energy into developing something that's positive. So if you're picturing yourself as Chinrezi, you're picturing yourself developing compassion, developing bodhicitta for all beings. And it's something that, it's like any muscle that you develop, we do it because it strengthens that aspect within ourselves. And so you actually begin being, oh, well, I've done this before. I can do it in the supermarket. I can do this with my boss. I can do this with my relatives I don't really want to talk to, and we can interact with other people and realize this is actually not that difficult to do. And it's not that difficult because we've kind of done the groundwork with a regular practice that's kind of scripted.
Cynthia.
Well, what Sarah just said, in some ways, is an example of what one might be able to do in the situation that I have. But when you asked about the edge of one's practice, I just instantly flashed on sort of the hurricane in my household yesterday afternoon between, two parents and a child. And there's often this feeling of, you take the bodhisattva vow to not abandon sentient beings, and yet it's clear that a bordering on teenage child needs space. He both needs space and connection at the same time. So that's the edge of my practice, is being there and feeling like my Dharma muscles are not yet strong enough to take away the suffering. And I went outside and there was actually blue sky. So just being able to remember whatever space you're in, that it's somehow sacred. How do you do that?
You do it over and over again. And I think it's also helpful not to have a particular expectation for what that would look like. Because that, I think, tends to engender some sense of defeat. There's a line in the part of there's a little piece in the refuge section in the Wonder of Practice where it talks, may the prayers of the bodhisattvas at all levels of enlightenment be realized. So all levels, bodhisattvas at all levels, those with whatever capacity. So I think it's important for us who have taken the bodhisattva vow to recognize what our limitations are at any given moment. It's also, I think, very important to recognize that when we say, when you said something, the words something like, I couldn't do this, I couldn't remove the suffering. Part of that, looking into that, we have to say, I couldn't, well, for the bodhisattva, they could say, I didn't bring somebody to full and complete enlightenment in this instant. Oh, crappy bodhisattva. So you think about what the scope of the project is. It's not just getting everybody to calm down and smile politely instead of while still thinking all the things that we're thinking. It's actually, the process is a long-term process. And the steps along the way, we have to honor those in whatever form that they take. And it may be that you could even do the mental experiment and say that in any given circumstance, if somebody came in and manifested a particular thing that we could recognize as, wow, what profound bodhicitta, what other people might not even recognize it. So it may be that your exact mode of interaction is the only thing that the other beings could even recognize as being a seed. And well, not just as a seed. They could actually handle at that point. It's kind of like the mandala, the dynamic requires a certain play. And if you just don't play, then what happened? You play your best. You play your part as best you can. And that's then we see something. We see some increment. You actually saw something nice about, I can go outside and I can see the blue sky. I can see the possibility of actually not being trapped in this. Just being able to have in your mind that you could step outside of that. Just showing the example that you could step outside of that. All these things are things to be honored and to open up the scope of, like, no, I doubt that I'm going to get this person that I am in the midst of a rather very intense dynamic with. I'm probably not going to get them to achieve full enlightenment in the next instant. So if we remember that that's the part of the play, is that we're actually planting seeds as best as we can in our own mind stream and in our activity that will bring about this in the long term. Then we do our best, and we come back and we reflect. We reflect. Is there anything I could have let go of a little sooner? What would it have been? What one thing? And then it's important to just have like one thing. Because by the time we go on a one thing, and another thing, and another thing, and another, then we're back to, well, I should be fully enlightened right now. That's what the end of the list is, that if we really add all up the and other things. So, sounds like you did fine. Sounds like it hurt. Our sympathies. May we remember something important when we're faced with the next situation, just by the virtue of you bringing up the seed of conversation.
I was thinking they always say that if the Buddha could have liberated all of us and removed all our suffering and brought us all to perfect liberation without us doing anything, he obviously would have done it, right? So it's not it's a big task. And then I was thinking just another part of our practice, which you're probably doing very well, is just the ability to be with uncomfortable situations that come up and to not shut down and to just, gotta get out of here, maybe you have to get out. I'm not saying you don't, maybe you have to physically move, but the idea of just being able to be with, to be open to major discomfort is an accomplishment of our practice.
Yeah. The Buddha had a cousin who heard all of the Buddha's teachings and had a phenomenal memory, and so could recite all the Buddha's teachings. But the teachings themselves had no impact on his cousin. And so his cousin said, the Buddha, this big shot, so you can see his aura 8 feet wide in the middle of the day, but other than that, there's nothing going on. So, the play of causes and conditions is more, that's a bigger beast than, like Dora said, if the Buddha could have just snapped his fingers, the Buddha would have done it. So. Peter.
I've been reading Old Path, White Cloud, and from one point of view, the world is, as described in that book, is composed of 3 kinds of people: monks, lay disciples, and those who aren't playing at all. And I guess I wind up a little confused because it seems to me that the lay disciples, as I understood it, as presented there, spent their lives trying to practice the 5 precepts, and the monks spent their lives totally devoted to following the path and in very much more strict ways. And it seems to me that what we're offered here is somewhere in between, and that is interesting and confusing to me. I don't think that we're described and encouraged to be better lay disciples, and certainly most of us aren't really planning on being full-time monks, and so I don't know where we are in between.
I'm not sure what the question is in this.
I guess in one way the question is, since we're not, most of us, at least as far as I can tell, planning on being full-time monks, what are we doing? And how do we get better at it?
What are we doing? But how do we get better at it? In a certain way, I think it's easier to to look at the question independent of the particulars of different levels of ordination, because the different levels of ordination don't necessarily accord with particular styles of practice. The vows are the vows, and those are practiced as vows. So with a fully ordained monk or nun, then there are 250 plus some particular vows that you abide by. And that's the practice of being a monk or a nun. And it also involves living in monastic community and developing your discipline within the community. So that's actually a monastic practice. The lay vows are exactly that. The practice of those vows are the following those vows. So that's different than are you practicing calm abiding? You might go to a monastery and you might find that they don't do any calm abiding. They might do other practices. They might do a lot of study. They might do a lot of recitation. But they might not do calm abiding, or might not do it very much. So distinguishing between what the practice is. And here we emphasize more the cultivation of the practices from the perspective of basically the Mahayana path. So the cultivation of bodhicitta, the cultivation of the profound wish for the liberation of all beings, including ourselves, and the cultivation of insight. That's where we're going with calm abiding. So those practices, and then within the practices related to bodhicitta, you have the four immeasurables, you have the six paramitas, so you have cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. You have the six paramitas to cultivate. And embedded within the six paramitas, you can find the Eightfold Path. So from the Tibetan perspective, generally speaking, the Mahayana perspective, you'll find the Eightfold Path embedded within the six perfections. So those are that's more the framework. So trying to place ourselves between lay disciples and fully ordained monks and nuns is probably, it's a picture that we're not actually working with. Some people will have taken one or more of the lay vows, but that's a different thing. And if you look at the yogis of Tibet, some were ordained, some were not. So and some of the ones that were most revered were not ordained monks or nuns. So there are two different frames of reference in a certain way. And I don't know whether or not that does anything to answer your question. I will confess complete ignorance. Perhaps you could tell me whether or not it did. Is that yeah? Do you have any? It didn't, or you shake your head. It's like
I'm still working with it.
You're still working. Okay, you're chewing on it. Okay. All right. Before you get started, is there somebody? Dora, do you have something?
Well, just adding, when you said, what are we doing? It's, we each are doing something. And so we each have a lot of choice as to what we want to do. And I think that, at KCC we try to provide certain kind of tools and frameworks, but and then to the point of, we each have 24 hours in a day. And so I think it's up to each of us to say, well, out of the tools I have. Do I have enough tools? And am I using the ones that I have? And how am I using my 24 hours? And from my past experience, what have I learned so far about how I've used my time? And I would point out that we have people right now who have been at our retreat center for 3 years, immersing themselves, presumably, in the practice. Now it's for a finite time, but that's giving them a taste of hopefully really trying to use every one of the 24 hours in as positive a way as possible, and applying the Dharma. So, but those people didn't decide to do that the first day that they came to KCC or to some other Buddhist thing. So it's obviously that, each person has a path, and it evolves, and it might evolve in such a way that, from what the feedback I'm getting from my efforts at this point make me think I want to do something more, or maybe not. Maybe I'm just feeling good about how I'm doing right now. So I feel like we do what we can at KCC, but there's so many other resources. But to kind of make possibilities, but each person needs to work their own path in there.
There's another way that practitioners have been traditionally divided up. And at first when you said, there are 3 kinds, I thought, oh, this is going to be it's like, no, it wasn't that at all. But one of the traditional divisions is just, they're practitioners of greater, middling, and lesser capacity. It's not very profound yet. And then when I thought I knew how it was going to go, that the practitioners of greatest capacity would be like Milarepa, and they would go off to caves. And I thought I had misheard it when it turned out exactly the opposite. The practitioners of least capacity actually require the container of very structured and isolated retreat in order to practice. It's actually the container that's necessary for that. The middling practitioner actually can function within a kind of a strict spiritual community. So a community of monks or nuns. There's enough structure, but they have the capacity to deal with all those annoying other monks and nuns. And that requires more capacity, but within that they still can manage to do some real practice. Then the practitioners of the greatest capacity are those who can practice effectively in day-to-day life without any structured help whatsoever. So if we can think of ourselves as, we're just kind of lowly crumb bum, just kind of bumping along, kind of occasionally doing some practice. We would think we're the lowest capacity. No, we're actually trying to do the practice that requires the highest capacity. The ability to really work in the completely unstructured environment of samsara, where anybody can throw anything at you anytime. And we usually go out looking for trouble to boot. So those are those are the three kinds of practitioners that I find more instructive, since most of us are not making as you said, we're not seriously entertaining the notion of taking off from family and friends and entering into and all lining up and overwhelming to venerable Tutin Chudren and showing up at Shavasti Abbey and all of a sudden quadrupling or quintupling the size of the number of monks and nuns that they have. Because there are very few opportunities really for people who wish to take on the vows and live in monastic community. There are very few opportunities for that here. But apart from that, then there is actually, in terms of the question of the longevity of the Dharma, it is necessary for enough people to, whether or not they actually are taking monastic ordination, it's necessary for enough people to actually devote themselves full-time or nearly full-time to the practice. So that's really central. So that's something that as kind of newcomers on the block in terms of taking on the Dharma as a society and as a community, that's something that we actually need to keep in mind. And that's one of the reasons that we created the 3-year retreat center, is to create an opportunity, at least for people, for some period of time, to immerse themselves basically 24 hours a day for a year or 3 years. So that's, at least we have created an opportunity for some people to do that aspect of the practice. Miriam, you had a shot already. I want to make sure.
So as someone who had heard that story in a limited form in the past, I just want to say that I'm glad that I've gotten to the point where I'm not so arrogant as to think that that means I'm the best practitioner. And so
that's part of looking for trouble.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I've been dealing with for a while, and your story really hit home, because I've been dealing with a hurricane in my own family, and it got to the point where I said to myself, I need to remove myself from this, but it just seemed to get so toxic. And while I am trying to be supportive to these two people, I feel like I need to save myself. And so I thought about it for a number of weeks and basically made the statement that if this happens again, I am going to walk out, but personally I can't help but think that that's some sort of a failure, or I guess you'd call it a cop-out, that you would just say, I can't help you, I have to live with you, but I need to save myself and walk out. That's not helping them, but I don't know how to help them.
Mm-hmm. Helping other people is even harder than helping ourselves. And that's something that I think is important to recognize in this. And I think you recognize something, that you actually need to help yourself. And when we can actually do that, when we find out how we can do that really deeply, then we have a better chance of actually being able to help anyone else. And that's the basic notion of taking refuge, is that we need to take refuge in one who's free from confusion. So if we're actually going to be a refuge for others, we also need to be free from confusion. And if we're lost in the hurricane, it's just at a practical level, it's not going to happen. And even though there are all those deep emotional strings that are pulling, and our wish that we could do better, all these things, they're important to kind of really accept as part of that dynamic. Though I don't like to say, well, I don't know about what you just said, but there's one thing that stands out. You said, that's not helpful to them. I don't know if that's true. Stepping back, just as you said, you went outside and looked at the clear blue sky. Just amongst the cards that you have in your hand, it might be that the most potent one to play for the benefit of everyone involved is the one that says, I'm stepping back. I'm not going to play in another way, because the other ways that I know how to play, the rest of my cards actually don't. They seem to be making anything else I could play will make things worse, as far as I can tell. So the one card that I do have, the one that I think is most beneficial, and I don't have all the cards that I might wish for, the one that's most beneficial is to step back. It won't necessarily make it feel wonderful, but I think there's, even if that's not true, if you take that and then make that into the thing that is most helpful, kind of pour a wish for that to actually be helpful, then that will become helpful. We're never dealt enough so that we do things absolutely cleanly. And we always have to work with the fact that we haven't done things cleanly. But that has to then be the ground for something else to happen. You could even say, the fact that I have screwed things up in the past, I'm thinking very much me now, the I, not the transferred you, but the fact that I have screwed something up really badly in the past actually has to become my cause for something better to happen. And then part of this, again, is stepping outside of the time frame where we expect a certain result in a certain time frame, to open it a little bit. Go. So, I hope that's helpful. You're welcome. So we can dedicate this, that all that we've done here, and we'll see, we can even say we dedicate all our past imperfections, that they may be the cause for our liberation and the liberation of other beings, however that might happen.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.